Hey, at least she'll be here.
Thursday, right?
Yeah.
The lecture test, yeah. Today. I've been studying. I don't know how well I'm studying. I never know how well it's working until the test, and I'm like, oh, I guess it didn't work, or I guess I did learn something. I'm trying though. Try.
Okay, how's it going? Hey, so this morning I just went through and looked at the study guide that I had posted from last year,
Most people.
2023. I went ahead and pulled out the stuff that we're not going to cover.
Literally
So,
everyone I've talked to is
we'll go ahead. I think I said today we have an exam on Thursday, right? Exam Thursday, and we'll start that at 8 o'clock. It should take you maybe an hour and a half at most to prepare and kind of go at a reasonable pace. Some people will be done probably in an hour or around there. Some people might want to sit and look at it for 3 hours. But that's up to you. We're not doing anything else that day, so come in, take the exam, and then leave when you're done. And there you go. We have a lab exam next Thursday. That one starts at 9 because I gotta get here at 6 to set it up, make sure everything's in the right spot. So we'll do the lab exam at 9, and that one also takes an hour to go through, and then you'll have whatever time you need after the exam to go back to station 1 if you want to visit. Some people will be done. Want to go back to the station and take a look at it again, so it's up to you. All right, so here we go. For our lecture exam 1 content, at the bottom, I had a study guide that said 2023, spring 2023. So I went ahead and updated this one for fall. We'll take a look at this right now. And what I did was, the other one, if you looked at it, it had in red topics that we weren't going to cover on this exam, but might do on a future exam. I just pulled those out. Or I changed the red back to black if it was something we didn't, right? So here's kind of what my idea of what a study guide is. This is not like make flashcards out of these things. That won't help you really. That's all you're doing is just memorizing that specific question. This is to make sure that you have, if you read the question like what's required of all scientific theory, that's a question. So if you can kind of generate a short narrative of what that question means or what the answer to it is, and then check your notes to see if you're correct. If your notes don't have it, then you probably are missing some stuff. You might want to look online to see if you have the answer, or ask in class. So again, these are not necessarily the questions from the exam. These are topics that we cover that you should be familiar with. So what we'll do here is we'll just kind of go through this. If you have any questions, I can answer them. I'll probably give you some suggestions of what types of questions will be on the exam here. That's useful. And then to prepare, your notes are kind of golden in that the way I describe it in class is probably how I'm going to ask the question. So we started out talking about scientific theory and what makes biology a science, right? And this is talking about pseudoscience. So what is basically required of all scientific theory? What's kind of the key features of a science inquiry that is different from the other inquiry? What's that? Yeah, so falsifiable is the way to say that. But yeah, it could be falsified or it could be wrong. But yeah, it's testable, right? So even if you can't test it today, I mean, at least it's feasibly testable, right? You can't invoke supernatural response. I mean, supernatural might occur, that's kind of outside of the normal. So right, so Sean, I might have just a short question asking you to relate something to whether it's testable or whether it is falsifiable, or maybe what a hypothesis is. Remember, a hypothesis is a statement, it's not a question. The question is, for example, the question is, does Bigfoot exist? The hypothesis is Bigfoot exists, right? And so, because it's a statement, the job of the experiment or the inquiry is to try to falsify it. So, what do you call a situation where a hypothesis is not falsifiable? We can never prove Bigfoot doesn't exist, right? Because you can't falsify a negative. You can't prove a negative, basically. So what is that called when you have scientific hypotheses that are not testable, falsifiable? Pseudoscience, yeah. So probably I'll have a question that relates to, hypothesis testing thing, and you should be able to recognize or at least say what pseudoscience is. Because, even though Bigfoot sounds like a silly answer, pseudoscience happens all the time. Even in real science, there is some of it that is still, kind of learning how to be correct. So it's important to recognize that so you can be a good, analytical thinker and make decisions for yourself. And there you go. Okay, so like I mentioned last, I think dietary supplements like echinacea doesn't kill you. I mean, if you make echinacea tea, you don't get poisoned. But there are people, including a lot of scientists and medical researchers, who believe that dietary supplements like echinacea have health benefits, just that it's never been proven. And so right now it's still kind of operating on pseudoscience principle that you can't falsify echinacea benefits you. All right. Okay. All right. So then we spent some time on that. There's not going to be any questions about the snail lab. That was basically just kind of an introductory lab to get you to do something. And the main purpose of that was to kind of give you an idea of why the classification naming system is so important. And so don't worry about, we're not going to do this, but the snail shells or any of the ballistic stuff that was on that lab, at least this exam. So then we went into the history of evolution. And the Lamarck, so there will be a question about Lamarck. And the reason why Jean Lamarck is so important is because he came up with essentially the first testable and falsifiable theory for how evolution might happen. And that's why we still talk about Lamarck today. And unfortunately for Lamarck, it was tested and falsified pretty quickly. Within 10, 20 years, Lamarck's ideas fell out of favor because they So just think of it this way. I'll probably have a question about Lamarck and maybe some scenario. And what was the main thing about Lamarck? How would you describe, one short statement? What was Lamarck's theory for evolution? What was the mechanism? Was that selective traits?
Acquired traits.
Acquired traits. So acquired traits was kind of like the little catchphrase, right? Acquired traits. So that's part of the answer. But what does it mean? I need you in the test to not only say acquired traits, which is great. I'm like, oh, okay, they remember that. But what does acquired traits mean? How do you acquire a trait? Environmental stress, and then what happens? You pass that response to that stress onto your offspring, right? So it's acquired traits. You have some environmental stress or strain, in climate change. Here's a scenario. Climate change causes the environment to get colder, so your offspring get passed on to them more fur or something, right? With larger body size. Something that basically allows your offspring to survive the stress that you experience. And that is what Lamarck proposed, right? So again, with Lamarck, there's some key things, like, acquired traits would be good. And you wouldn't necessarily even have to say acquired traits to be right, so long as you explain some sort of environmental strain or stress an organism experiences is passed on to their offspring with an adaptation for overcoming that, right? Okay, so anyway, we still talk about Lamarck because I think it's important because it's really a mark of progress in science where hypotheses are testable and falsifiable. And even though Lamarck was wrong at the time, it's important because that is essentially, science basically came into its own in the 1800s, especially biology, really. The 1800s was a revolutionary time for biology because of, this type of inquiry. So anyway, interestingly enough, the very year that Lamarck published his book, Philosophy of Zoology, 1809 was the year Darwin was born. So then, 20-some years later, 1832 or whatever it was, Darwin ends up on this voyage of the Beagle, this Royal Navy Geographic Expedition ship. What was Darwin's original job on the voyage?
Fitzroy's dinner buddy.
Yeah, captain's dinner buddy. I mean, that's my little statement of it. But I think the main thing to note on the voyage there is that Darwin wasn't originally the naturalist. Like the general notion was that he was brought on as some sort of scientific observer that was going to be the ship's naturalist. The reality is he was on there for like a social reason, right? The captain needed a dinner buddy that was of suitable aristocratic status, and Darwin was free to go do whatever he wanted. He paid his own way. So I think it's important to kind of know the context of the time of who Darwin was and what he was doing. Okay, so what we're going to do for those questions is I will have like a kind of like a timeline or a travel log of Darwin. And we talked about, I believe it was like 5 key themes, right? One of them was, how did he end up on the ship in England in 1832? And then we went on to talk about several stops, right? So the first stop was St. Iago or the island of Santiago or the Cape Verde Islands. There's multiple names for it, but basically the first stop that we talked about, there was a key event that happened there. So not only was there a key event, but there was also a really important book that kind of solidified for Darwin. So what was that first stop at St. Iago or Santiago? Yeah. Okay, so we saw lava rocks and coral layers, like a coral lava sandwich, right? That was good. And you also saw an erupting volcano, like it was actively erupting at the time. And so what did that, what was the basic theme of that stop? Yeah, so Lyell had a book called Principles of Geology. And the important thing about Lyell's Principles of Geology was the first geology book, or geology textbook, that essentially tried to argue a naturalistic explanation for landforms and earth processes. So Lyell basically said that landforms, like river valleys and mountain ranges and coastlines, form over very long periods of time, so slowly that we can't see them in a lifetime, but and those processes are still happening today. And that was kind of like a big difference from geologists before Lyell that were trying to explain all the mountain ranges and river valleys in regards to theistic stories. Basically they're trying to prove, Old Testament floods, based on geological features. So Lyell was the first, basically the big transition in science, towards more of a naturalistic explanation of things. And so that's important because that was an influence of Darwin. Clearly later on, Darwin thought about gradualism, that species change gradually over time. And that was the huge influence Lyell had. So as long as you would say on that stop that Darwin saw geological features like an erupting volcano and a coral lava rock sandwich on the coastline, that influenced his interpretation of Lyell's principles of geology. That's probably enough. The term uniformitarianism is kind of cool and everything. You wouldn't necessarily have to say that, but essentially explaining it's helpful, meaning that processes that form the Earth are still happening today, just very, very slowly, so we can't see them, in a lifetime. Okay, so that's good. The next stop was Brazil. I kind of combined together some things that happened in Brazil and Argentina. But basically the idea is Darwin ends up, getting off the ship, and what does he see in Brazil? What's the big thing there?
Immense diversity.
Yeah, tropical rainforest. So he sees tropical rainforest, huge, diversity, fertility in the forest. And so, what was the aha moment, and what book did that help him understand? Yeah, so Thomas Malthus, you don't need to do the first name, but Malthus was a economist or economics person at the time, and wrote a book called On Populations. But the important thing about Malthus was that Malthus argued that, well, what did Malthus argue? What was his main premise that helped Darwin understand the Brazilian rainforest compared to maybe England's diversity? Yeah. Exponential population. Yeah, so populations grow exponentially, like J-shaped, right? But how do resources grow? Yeah, geometrically or linearly. So the resources like crop fields will grow geometrically, meaning like 10 acres, 20 acres, 30 acres, 40 acres. Meaning basically, they increase in size by a linear fashion, whereas populations grow exponentially. So Malthus basically argued that populations will always outgrow their resources. And so, so the idea basically is that, the greater the resources, the greater the population diversity, the fewer the resources, the greater the competition. So I guess the comparison of resource growth versus population growth is what Malthus really explained. And we see this with Darwin, right? What is that? Darwin's mechanism for natural selection was resources are limited and populations remain relatively constant, and that kind of gave Darwin kind of his mechanism for how natural selection goes. So for Brazil, it would be key if you could state that tropical rainforest with its great diversity, and the influence was Malthus's on populations, which related resources to population or population diversity. Yeah.
Is it okay if we say like east or south coast of South America?
If you say what?
If we say like which coast of South America instead of Brazil? Like if we just say east coast of South America?
East coast, sure. Yeah,
okay.
That's fine. Yeah. I think in that case, what'll happen is I'll have Brazil listed.
Okay.
And you just explain what happened there.
Yeah.
Okay. And that's sort of how it's going to go. It's like I'll say England, at this date, Cape Verde Islands, this date, Brazil. Next stop is Chile, which is the west side of South America. There's a whole bunch more stops in this, but I'm just kind of summarizing the important ones. What did Darwin see in Chile? Yeah, so he saw fossils. He saw a couple examples of fossils that resembled currently living species, right? So he saw the clam shells, thousands of feet up in the mountains that resembled the clams that were down by where the Beagle was anchored. He saw the Glyptodon fossil that was a large armadillo that resembled the currently living smaller armadillos that we eat. And so, yeah, he saw this fossil relationship. And what was the key kind of aha moment with that? What was the deal? How would you interpret what he thought about that? Yeah, so species change over time. You have a connection of extinct fossilized things that were likely or possibly the ancestors or relatives of things that are living today. So it was evidence to him, kind of like the evidence that he saw in St. Iago with the coral volcano sandwich, that basically this place changes over time. He's seeing that species change over time with fossils. Okay, and then the Galapagos. The Galapagos is probably the most famous visit. My whole point of that day of talking about it was that the Galapagos in and of itself wasn't really enough. Darwin put it all together. The Galapagos, though, is kind of the one that sort of like seals the deal for everybody. So what's the, what did Darwin see on the Galapagos? He saw tortoises, turtles, tortoises. How's turtle and tortoise different? Tortoises, land turtle. And what about tortoises that he saw?
They're like in the same island. They're similar. They're the same species, but like different.
Yeah, so different islands had different versions or different traits or different flavors of tortoises, right? In terms of their shell type, etc. And then what else did he see? The finches, the birds. Now these were actually different species that lived in different habitats and different islands. And so what was kind of the big idea with Galapagos? Yeah. So the habitat, food resources, but mainly the food resources, but also the environment. Species will basically specialize to those food environments, so that's kind of like the big thing. It's basically this adaptation for favorable traits for your, if you feed on seeds, the birds had a thicker beak. If the birds were feeding on insects, they had a thinner needle-like beak to get the insects. So specialization for habitat with the tortoises and for food with the finches was kind of the big aha there. Okay, then Darwin goes back to England, and he waits like almost 25 years to publish his theory of natural selection. So I guess, let's see here. Maybe one thing to say for that one would be what one phrase kind of best describes Darwin's theory of natural selection.
Descent with modification.
Yeah, the descent with modification. The idea is that populations or generations will pass on favorable traits to their offspring, but it's not based on strain or stress like Lamarck said. It's based on individuals with the favorable traits who will reproduce or have more offspring or have higher reproductive success than ones that don't have favorable traits, right? That's the fundamental difference between Darwin's natural selection and Lamarck. Let's see here. And then here's a fun one. This will be a question. Why is the phrase survival of the fittest a logical fallacy? What's the problem? Say what's that?
Circular reasoning argument.
Yeah, circular reasoning. So why is it? Why is survival of the fittest circular reasoning? What does fitness mean in biology? It means surviving long enough to reproduce, right? So fitness means reproductive success. So what you're saying is survival of the ones that have reproductive success or ones that live long enough to reproduce. Essentially, you're saying survival of those who survive ultimately, which is a circular reasoning argument, right? Like it's duh, that's pretty easy. But I think what happened is people misinterpreted fittest as like fast or strong or big or crafty, and so, but that's not what fitness in biology means. Fitness in biology means reproductive success, and so essentially what that's suggesting is that it's kind of a non-useful statement, but it was very, very catchy and people liked it. So it was still won't die. That's why we're mentioning it here in zoology, is because I'd like you to understand that it's really not a useful tool. Sometimes it's used as a straw man argument for entities that would like to discredit Darwin here. So I'm not going to ask you who made the phrase. Probably the question would be more so like Herbert Spencer was an economist that coined the phrase, you know, and then I'll ask you to explain why this phrase is not useful. Okay. I think on the exam, what I noticed is, you know, there's usually a little space for you to write your answer. Think about writing answers that are more than just like one-word answers or one or two-word answers. I think that, you know, you have time. You know, there's no time constraint on the test. If there's follow-up or additional information that you think would be helpful for me to understand, that you understand, put it down, right? So, if you need an extra pen because you're worried about your ink supply, let me know and I'll help you out, right? But I do find that some students, I think, err on the side of like, I think that was enough. One word, okay? And there's like a big, 4-inch space to write something. Probably need to write a couple sentences at least, right? So anyway, so with regards to survival of the fittest, don't just write tautology or logical fallacy. Make it a complete sentence, right? Say something like, survival of the fittest is circular reasoning because fitness in biology means to reproduce or reproduce success. Yeah, that's essentially what survival is. Okay? You just gotta live long enough to ask the salmon a second. Okay, so those are pretty good. All right, so on the natural selection, I'm not gonna have a question that's basically like asks you to regurgitate the 5 observations and 3 inferences. But I will have a question on the 3 types of natural selection. So in that case, I think I told you how I do that, is I'll have like 3 little brief descriptions of some scenario. And you are going to have to apply whether that natural selection is directional selection, stabilizing selection, or disruptive selection, right? So you'll have to kind of interpret the little paragraph or a little short couple sentences, and then tell me what type of selection it is. And I'd like you to maybe, it's really helpful to have a little diagram. On the board, I drew like a little graph that showed each one. The book has a little graph that shows each one. So you should be able to do like a little plot, right? The little plot was like directional selection was something like this. You have some trait range, and you have frequency on the y-axis. And in the case of directional selection, it was something like this. You had a population that was covering the range, and in directional selection, you have the population is pushed to kind of one extreme. So some way you could do that, that's great, that'd be helpful for me to get that you understand it. But the reason why it's called directional is one extreme of a trait is favored over the other extreme. There you go. There was also a similar looking plot for stabilizing selection in the middle, and there was a plot for disruptive or diversifying selection, which was both extremes. The middle is not favored. So that's pretty easy. So read the little statement carefully. I think it's pretty clear, but in that case, there's only 3 examples, and you have 3 options. So you realize there's also a little bit of elimination that goes on. You know for sure one's directional, then the other 2 have to be either stabilized or disruptive. Right? But I think it's pretty clear. Some people still have some problems with reading comprehension, so make sure you kind of carefully read those. Any questions on that? Pretty straightforward. If you need help or you want to review that, I also have, some of these lecture videos are still posted from the COVID days. If you have insomnia or nothing else, you can go and review those. But I think your notes should be good enough if you have. Okay, so then there will be a kind of a short compare and contrast of microevolution to macroevolution. I drew a nifty little diagram of microevolution to macroevolution with an arrow connecting them, right? So there's a couple key things that you need to know about this. I mean, this is a pretty deep thing, but you should basically know what microevolution definition is versus macroevolution, what connects them. I'll get from you later on some other factors of microevolution, but basically I think there was like 5 microevolutionary mechanisms and 2 macroevolution mechanisms, right? We had in microevolution, we had natural selection, sexual selection, genetic drift, mutation, and horizontal gene transfer. Right? Those are 5 things that were contributing. But somewhere else in the test, I'm going to kind of be getting those things from you. So I don't. But what's the main thing? What's the definition of microevolution? What is it? Change in alleles, or what's an allele?
In the population.
Heritable trait. So alleles is just a fancy way to say a heritable trait. So if the population has any change in the frequency of heritable traits, or alleles, better way to say it, that's microevolution. So that's within one species, change within species over time. And then what was the? No, this is interesting because it's not in a textbook. It's kind of hard to find, but basically, how long does it take for microevolution to happen? Yeah, like 1 to 1,000 generations. That's just a generality. That's a useful way to think about it. It's the timeline of generations. Okay, so here is an answer for that question. I always hate saying this because I don't want to influence. So put your pencils down right now. Don't write this down. But if I write what is microevolution and you write small evolution, that's not You're right, micro means small, but it's not answering the question, right? So just think about that. In the past, when that's happened, someone will write, I'll write microevolution.
That's just the result of something.
It's small evolution.
They're like,
I kind of need a definition. I don't want just be phrasing the question. I'm finding that, especially in the last 10 years, there's been this really clever way. I don't know what it is about, the change in attitude or high school education or whatever. People are really good at rephrasing the question as an answer. And I'm like, it's great, but stuff written, but you don't say anything. So just be careful. I want you to, try to explain the question with an answer, not a reword.
oh, that's real. I totally did that.
Okay, so then also macroevolution, yes, it is big evolution. But what is macroevolution? What's the
Large
definition?
evolution.
Speciation. So changing species. Species change over time. So usually it is referring to one species divides or diverges to become two different species. Okay, so that's macroevolution. The definition of speciation. That'd be good enough for me. What were the mechanisms for macroevolution? I listed 2. What's that? Allopatric speciation is one of them. And what's the other one? Sympatric. Okay. Allopatric and sympatric. And I know that these terms are kind of weird, like allopatric. Why don't they just say what it is? What is allopatric speciation? What does that mean? What has to happen for allopatric speciation to happen? Yeah, so geographic separation. So some sort of geographic isolation or separation has to happen to start. And that's the very beginning of all allopatric speciation. It's geographical separation. And there's 2 mechanisms that I gave on that one. One was where a geographic feature separates the population. What's that called? Vicariance. And the other one where maybe a small group migrates away from the main population and colonizes like an island, like Hawaiian Island colonized, right? What's that called? Yeah, founder effect or dispersal. Founder effect, that would do that work. I would accept founder effect, but how I described it was dispersal on the test day or on the lecture day. But founder effect would be a suitable answer. Dispersal was the answer there. So vicariance and dispersal were the two ways you could geographically isolate populations. Great. Okay, we'll come back to some pattern. Once you have the geographic separation, there basically was a whole suite of mating isolating mechanisms that you reinforce. So the idea here is when you do geographic separation, you stop gene flow. So reproductive isolation is established by geography initially. The idea is over time, over 1,000 to 1,000 generations, you have all kinds of little microevolutionary changes that happen in one population that maybe don't happen in the other population. So given enough time, like 10,000 generations, potentially when those populations get back together again, they would not meet. They would basically be reproductively isolated based on biological features, right? That's kind of the idea. So I listed 4 what are called pre-mating mechanisms. I listed 2 post-mating mechanisms, and then I kind of combined all of the post-zygotic ones into one idea. But so on this one, I'm going to have a couple pages, and it'll give you like a little scenario. Like these are real examples. These are examples that I found that are whatever. So like for example, okay, so try to think how to say this. I'm going to have a whole bunch of scenarios written out, which will give you a little picture to help you kind of get an idea. And in each one, it'll ask you what is the most appropriate or the most likely reproductive isolating mechanism you're seeing here. Many of these could potentially have more than one, right? Like for example, in class I gave you lions and tigers. I mean, clearly a kindergartner would tell you those are different species, right? No problem. It's obvious different species. And how I described it in class was these are ecological barriers, right? They live in different habitats. They have different food resources. Obviously, lions and tigers also have behavioral differences. Obviously, they also have probably temporal differences, meaning like timing of mating. What was the 4th one? I guess was it geographic the first one?
Yeah, there's
Geographical, ecological, behavioral, and temporal, right? The 4 pre-mating ones. Okay. The geographical. Right. So anyway, what I'm trying to say is, with the lion and tiger example, I mean, you could probably apply the lion and tiger example to all of them. Probably mechanical isolation is probably true there too. Probably gamete fusion issues. And obviously, post-zygotic, they're hybrids or sterile. So here's what I'm trying to say is when I write out the description of the test, I'm targeting a specific mechanism. I'm trying to get you to think about whether it's ecological, behavioral, temporal, geographical, or the mating ones. For the post-mating, I'm trying to get you to identify whether it's mechanical or maybe gamete fusion barrier, or whether it's a hybrid inviability, whether they don't survive or don't reproduce, or sterile. And an example of the lions and tigers, you could basically apply those to all of them, right? Don't invoke things that aren't written in the question. And so what happens sometimes is, people kind of go off on a rabbit trail of other possible things that it could be, when in my mind, like, the question is so obvious what the answer is, but you will write everything but the answer, right? And so I'm not trying to trick you. There's no like side answer or like sneaky answer. I'm trying to be super obvious. So like if in the question it shows like a little chart that shows like months, like February, March, April, May, June, right? What's the only isolating mechanism that deals with time? What's that? Temporal, right? Time means temporal, that's what temporal means. It's isolating by major time or times. So if the question mentions something about the time of year, a month, for example, it's temporal, right? Sure, a behavioral or a polyploidy might be correct for that species, but it's not part of the question, right? Just think about that. You call it a red herring. What's a red herring? Yeah, so a red herring in philosophy, you learn about logical fallacies and arguments. And a red herring is information that's not necessary to answer the question, right? And really, ultimately, the organisms I'm talking about, like one of the questions will have like sea urchins, a picture of sea urchins on there. And it'll say some statement about why these sea urchins can't reproduce together. The sea urchins are kind of a red herring. It's the why they can't reproduce, the explanation for the mechanism for reproductive barrier is the question. But some people go off on I saw a grasshopper. Tell me another story. So just think about reading the question carefully and realize each one has a best, most likely right answer. Even if other answers could apply, there is one answer that is the best answer. So think of that carefully. And again, with those questions, it'd be helpful to have at least don't just say temporal.
It is this because
Right, temporal isolation. They made a different time of year, right? That's super helpful to me because lets me know that this person's got it. I don't have to worry about it. Now there are some students who write temp. Yeah, for the bathroom. Okay, so there we just listed them. There was 4 pre-mating mechanisms, isolating mechanisms. Geographical was the one that was the initial one. How would you know a geographical isolation if you saw it on a question? Yeah. Sure. And if nothing else is described, like if nothing like a behavior, like a mating call or song or coloration, or temporal, there's no calendar shown or time of day, or if there's no ecological habitat being shown, I think geographical. And same thing with if you see an example of like a behavioral. What was an example of a behavioral isolation? Yeah. Mating calls or mating coloration. If you're seeing an example of a mating call or something, you know it's behavioral, right? Yeah.
What's the difference between the geographical and the ecological?
That's good because organisms can live in the same geography, but they can live in different habitats. Okay. So think of like a grassland species versus a forest species. But grassland forest, you easily walk from one to the other. That's good. That's a really good question. But yeah. So it has to do with food resources. Good question. Okay, let's see. Okay. What is a ring species? So there will be one question that basically sets up and shows you an example that's a ring species. How do you know a ring species is a species? What would be the what is the definition of a ring species? That's what it is. So the question will be the question won't be what's a ring species. The question will be there'll be some scenario and it's a ring species example. I'm hoping you see this ring species example and you know why this is important. So, what is a ring species?
They're like separated, and then when they came back, they couldn't reproduce, but they could still reproduce with the original species, but not the.
Sure. So what you're saying is, like in some parts of the range, they reproduce, they breed, and have viable offspring. But in other parts of the range, they don't, right? So it's confusing because our definition of a species is reproductive isolation, but the population is not totally isolated, right? Like around, the long way around, there's gene flow, but two populations that are right next to each other don't reproduce, right? So technically they're still the same species because over many, many generations you might have, a mutation that happens here would eventually get around the ring, but it might take 1,000 generations, right? Yeah. Salmon. Which one? Chinooks are, the Chinooks, that's kind of hard because, the ring species, you kind of expect that they're all there at the same time, in the ring state. But the ring species is more of a geographical phenomenon. I think the salmon is a timing phenomenon. Right? So with the salmon, they're all in the same spot, but the salmon's not called ring species. So I think that's a good question. I hadn't thought of that. But in that case, it is, and because it's a timing thing, the ring thing doesn't apply. I think it's called a ring species because when you look at a map, you can draw like a hoop, something like that. That's where it comes from. But that's a great question. You're right. It's a good observation that like spring run Chinook and fall run Chinook don't directly interbreed, but they could potentially share genes through them. But they're not called ring species. So good question. Let's see, what is it? Okay, so the ring species is interesting. So here's the part that I enjoy. I like to write questions like this. I'll ask you in the ring species example, I gave you the salamanders. I'll say, I think it was Xanthopicta and Platenses were the two subspecies that didn't interbreed, right? But they both interbred through Organenses, the one in the north. So the question is, are Xanthopicta and Platenses different species or are they the same species, right? And what's a good answer for that? The same species, sharing subspecies that they can dies out. Yeah, so I guess they're the same species because there's still gene flow, right? They're still reproducing with Platenses or the Organenses in the north, right? But as you said, if the one in the north went extinct or died out because of a wildfire, climate change, or whatever, we would have to call those, the two ones don't interbreed, different species. So I guess questions like that, what I'm hoping for is an insightful. It depends, right? I mean, I think one of the best ways to think about answers in zoology or biology is in a lot of cases, the answer depends on the scenario, right? Are the Xanthopicta and Platenses different species? Well, they behave like different species, but there's still gene flow to the north. So technically, they're the same species, but they also resemble separate species. That's a really good answer because, as you probably learned like in logic or philosophy classes, in a debate, it's really good for the debaters to know both sides of the argument, right? So I think in that case, if I ask you the question like in a ring species, are these two populations different species or the same species? If you could kind of give me the if-then kind of answer, meaning they don't reproduce in their local habitat, which would indicate they're different species, but they do reproduce through other populations, which leads to the same species, right? What you're saying, right? So that's like a sophisticated answer, but I think in my mind, things like ring species, which are kind of controversial, there are some biologists that will poo-poo and argue that ring species aren't a thing, but they really are just one species. But I think it's an important example of macroevolution, allopatric speciation happening like right before our very eyes. Like for example, I said, you said if the northern population were wiped out or went extinct, the remaining population would have to be considered separate species. So it's a good transition. All right, so and the ring species example will not be the definition, it will be something else. Right? So you know what you can do is you can go Google ring species example. I think it's only like 6 posted all over. Probably see it, and then you know, oh, that's one of the ring species examples. Or you even read the example. Okay, that's one of the questions there. Any questions on that for species? So you can probably look that up pretty easily. Species concepts. So anyway, I think that what I was looking for here is for me to kind of get an appreciation for how our definition of species has changed over time. Carl Linnaeus was the one that came up with the species concept. Like he invented the whole idea that every organism is made up of a genus and species name. They're nested into families, orders, classes, etc. And then Darwin, came up with his definition of species because species is how basically natural selection operates at species level. And then Meyer came up with the species concept that we still use today as kind of like the major definition. How would all these differ? Like, I don't know. Linnaeus and Darwin wasn't really that different, right? Well, I think Linnaeus was species were as they were created, and his job or scientist's job was to kind of describe them and name them, right? So he was looking at, I guess, what do you call like typological species, meaning like just like phonetic, like species are different based on the physical appearance. And then Darwin's species is something that we came up with, right? It's our artifact that we use to describe closely species that resemble each other, basically. Organisms that resemble each other. So Darwin is an example of a transition from the theistic explanation of species to maybe more of a humanistic explanation of species. And then the one that's most important though is Meyer. Why is Meyer's definition of species the most accepted today, and why is it useful? Well, what was Meyer's definition of species? Fertile offspring. So Meyer basically argued that you're in the same species if you can reproduce and your offspring are viable or fertile. That's the definition of what a species is, right? So you have interbreeding natural populations are members of the same species. And the reason why that is still the most popular today is why kind of goes back to and our scientific inquiry. Why is Meyer's biological species concept still it can be tested, right? It's testable. You could test it. I mean, it's impractical to test it with 10 million species out there. Having to do all possible combinations. But it's testable, right? And it's falsifiable. You could see if natural populations produce offspring or group them in a species, or you could see if there's reproductive isolation to separate them. And that's why Meyer's definition of species is still used today, because it is testable and falsifiable. It gives a finite definition of what species is. So, okay, what is the primary problem with Meyer's species concept? Yeah. Yeah, most so, but to me, I think this is cool because, look, not all the answers apply to all the questions. So Meyer's is a very important species definition that applies to many animals, many plants, etc. But considering that most bacteria, fungi, and protists are asexual, you know, it's difficult to apply to all scenarios. But that's the way science goes in progress there. We'll talk about how this has been overcome in exam 2 with genetic species concept. Exam 2, but for right now, we're going to focus on higher. Asexual species is a problem. Other problem with the biological species concept is sometimes you can have a hybrid that is fertile, but actually acts like its own species, and that is that's what sympatric species is, right? So a sympatric species is where you have a new species appear in the range of a existing species. So there's no geographic separation. So what's the primary mechanism for sympatric speciation? Polyploidy, right? Polyploidy is where you have doubling or tripling or quadrupling of chromosomes. Chromosome number multiplies in the offspring. And that makes them incompatible with the parents, right? You have a different number of chromosomes, one generation. That's what polyploidy is, okay? And what group of organisms best use polyploidy to diversify? Plants. Plants love polyploidy. They're all about it. Probably half of all flowering plant species arose by polyploidy. 95% of the produce that you buy in the grocery store are polyploidy. So the polyploidy is important in plants. There's very few examples of animal polyploidy. I think there's only about a dozen examples in the literature. For some reason, animals don't do it very well. It causes reproductive or developmental problems. So anyway, that being said, there was two basic types of polyploidy. Allopolyploidy and autopolyploidy. I know the term allo is being used in a couple spots, but you should just know that allo means separate, right? Allo just means separate. So whether it's allopathic or allopolyploidy, that little root helps you know what it means. What is allopolyploidy? How do you know if you see it? Yeah, two separate species reproduce and make a hybrid, right? Like a horse and a donkey. If they had made a mule, and if that mule became a polyploid and fertile, that would be allopolyploid, right? So two separate species, good. So the name allo means separate, so you know that basically means that you have, two different things that are reproducing that make a hybrid that becomes viable. I mean, mules aren't. That's just a bad example. But the example I did give was modern wheat, right? Wheat is a hybrid of wild wheat species, or wild rice species, that have hybridized at least 2 or 3 times. And what our modern wheat is basically, it's like a hexaploid. It's a 3 times the chromosome sets of any of the ancestor species, and that likely happened in a few 1-generation jumps. So that's allopolyploidy. Autopolyploidy is what? How would you know when you see it?
It skips the sterile hybrid.
So yeah, one parent species, a normal species, has an offspring that has a multiple chromosome number. So suddenly that offspring population can't back cross with the parents, but it can potentially cross with their siblings. I gave 2 examples: the tree frog, Hyla versicolor, the tree frog that in some populations has 48 chromosomes, and other populations has 96 chromosomes. So you basically, the frog looks the same, but they don't reproduce in nature, or if they do reproduce, they don't produce offspring that are viable. But when you look at them, the 2 populations, there's one has double the chromosome of the other one. So that's a good example of autopolyploidy. Auto means self, right? So you have self-species polyploidy. The other example I gave was the marble crayfish. that this is, rubble crayfish is a species of crayfish in Georgia, but in an aquarium in Europe, polyploid was formed that now has taken over Europe, parts of Africa, Asia, and actually has come back to the US and invaded. And it does not reproduce with parent because it's asexual, right? It's all females. So autopolyploidy, I believe autopolyploidy is the only polyploidy seen in animals. I don't know of any examples of allopolyploidy in animals. So anyway, on the exam, there'll be like a little scenario that represents polyploidy. The answer will be polyploidy. How do you know it? Like, what would be the key piece of evidence that you would look for that the answer should be polyploidy? Any reference of chromosome numbers or chromosomes, right? Any statement about chromosome numbers or indication of chromosome numbers, polyploidy is probably the answer, okay? And in addition to polyploidy, which is the overall idea, I'll probably ask you to interpret whether it's allo or autopolyploidy. And so think about that. If all you see is two populations, one has double the chromosomes for the other one, it's probably autopolyploidy, right? If it's an example where you see a hybrid that has become its own thing, you know, two parent populations result in an offspring that has double the chromosome number, it's probably allopolyploidy, right? So just think about that. One year, for some reason, I don't know what happened, someone, or maybe it's just a person, they wrote polyploid like as the answer for almost all the questions. Like, it's probably just going to be one question. So just think about that. And if chromosomes aren't mentioned, don't write polyploid. Okay. All right. I think we've gotten down to everything.
Do you really want to make sure?
And we used up our hour here. Any other questions? Yeah. You know, it's basically, it might, generally speaking, it's one generation, but in the case of the wheat, there were multiple hybridization events that happened. And so that would have been the first hybrid, the first polyploid, would have been one generation, but then succeeding
because
hybrids
if they have
happened.
the females
So
like reproduce, they just kept like
Yeah.
doubling
Are all
the
the
genes.
tutor phylum things
It's
gonna be
like
on the
a-
lecture exam?
That's not an example. Yeah, that's not an example. So, yeah.
My question is, post-mating and post-zygotic the same thing?
Post-mating, post-zygotic is post-mating. But, so, the way the textbook does it is they have like multiple, they'll go like pre-mating, and then they'll go post-mating pre-zygotic, and then they'll go post-zygotic. And I thought that's confusing. So I just went up this progression. Pre-mating means doesn't happen, right? Post-mating means matings happen, but you don't have the eggs and sperms for the pollen and ovum connected in any way. And then post-zygotic means you had fertilization, but the organism doesn't develop right or it's sterile or what have you. So yes, post-mating is, post-zygotic is also post-mating, but I think that, to me, is a clearer way to describe it. Yeah. I mean, obviously, if you're a hybrid, mating could happen, you know, and gamete fusion could happen. So I just feel like the way that the book describes it is a little bit too confusing. It's like what we call a compound. Okay, yeah.
I don't know if I printed this before you edited it or something, but I have a question about how do paleontologists deal with the species concept?
Yeah, and those were, I believe those. Yeah,
Okay.
that's what I was saying, I went through this morning, went through the study guide.
Oh, this morning.
And I
you did.
edited it. This
Okay.
one now says 2024, that one says 2023 on top of it.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So,
No problem.
yeah, good. Any other questions? All right, we have, today, our last group of phylum. We actually have, 3 phyla to look at today. There's no classes, in the phyla, so just 3 different groups. And this is the last lab leading up to our lab exam. So this Thursday, we have a lecture exam, no lab. next Tuesday, we'll get your lecture exam back, and then we will have like a lab review today. And so today is the last bit of information for the lab exam, and so you'll kind of get an idea of how that goes. So let's go ahead and take a kind of a long break. We'll go like 20 after, a little over 10 minutes. Long 10-minute break. And I'll get specimens out.